Good evening, everyone. Good evening. What a delightful evening. Are we so happy with this weather, right? Yeah, it's very, very nice. I'm so thrilled. And I'm just delighted to see so many of you here tonight. This is a first for us. We've not done an event like this, and we weren't quite sure what the response would be. And I'm just happy to say that we are sold out. It's great. Well, I'm Patricia Moradian. I'm president and CEO of the Henry Ford, and welcome. This is a beautiful setting in Greenfield Village for an evening of inspiration. And before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to just recognize a couple of individuals here. Our board chair, who I just spoke to on the phone, he's actually on his way. Evan Weiner will be here, and our trustee and proud father of one of our presenters tonight, Vievee Francis. Her father, George Francis, has been on our board for about 2 decades. George, raise your hand. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Our founder, Henry Ford, believed in the power of artifacts, real artifacts, to help tell the important stories of our past. Those stories of innovation, of resourcefulness, of ingenuity, stories of ordinary people who do something extraordinary in an effort to make a difference in this world. It's our mission at the Henry Ford to bring that past forward and connect our audiences today with the artifacts that represent those unprecedented achievements of individuals who are part of the collective fabric of our society, of our world, and peoples whose creativity encourage us to see things maybe a little differently and to inspire that better future. Robert Frost was one of those individuals and a very celebrated poet in America, receiving 4 Pulitzer Prizes. He lived in this home for 3 years as a professor at the University of Michigan and in Ann Arbor, and he used this space as a creative salon, if you will, welcoming his young students and colleagues to work with him, to collaborate, to inspire each other, and to have really interesting discussions about the world they saw. So tonight we're going to bring that past forward. I couldn't think of a better setting, and certainly better weather and better company like all of you to share that with. We're presenting modern poetry and literature from poets and writers inspired by the words and wisdom of Robert Frost. And of course, as you know, we will have a wonderful farm-to-table dinner in Eagle Tavern after the presentation here. I'd like to introduce briefly our speakers for this evening. Our friend and trustee, Paul Dimond, is right here, and his co-author, Martha Grimes. Paul and Martha will be reading from their book, The Belle of Two Arbors. And at the dinner portion, we're going to hear from award-winning poet Vievee Francis, and Vievee is the author of 3 very important books, but we'll get into that detail just prior to her speaking. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Executive Vice President Christian Overland of this organization. He worked very closely with Paul in putting tonight together and has a few little personal comments to make before we begin the program. So thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Patricia. You're in a ground where a lot of people have talked about amazing ideas and have inspired a lot of people to do amazing things. And I wanted to share a story with you that right on the lawn here, Vievee Francis and Paul Dimond came together a few years ago and talking about, wouldn't it be great if we could actually have Robert Frost connected, his poetry and his inspiration, his creativity, to young authors today. And so they are the ones that came up with this idea. Paul had been working on his book, I think 7 years in at that point at least. And I've had the pleasure to read Paul's manuscript before it was published and work with him on it. And it really is a wonderful manuscript and book, along with Marty Grimes' poetry. And one of the things I like to say about it as a historian, historical fiction and historical novels really have their place in the canon of American history. It allows us to get closer to the past through characters that we know and love, like Robert Frost, Auden, Rethke, those poets. But also what he has done and what Marty has done is really develop this wonderful manuscript and text of Michigan at that time in the 20s, but also with wonderful characters that bring the past alive and connect to us today. One of the things about the Henry Ford that we talk about is bringing the past forward. And what you're going to hear tonight are 2 great authors who've done that. Wonderful achievement. So without further ado, Paul Dimond and Marty Grimes.
Thank you, Christian and Patricia. You see, one of my problems is I can't see as well as I used to. So we'll try this. Maybe I'll look more professorial. As a trustee of the Henry Ford for 20 years, it's kind of fun to be here in a different role for a change, particularly at a house that 80 years ago was moved to this site from Ann Arbor. And when Henry Ford moved it here, he didn't even think he knew it was the Robert Frost house. He bought it because of this wonderful architecture, which fits its own archetype with the rest of the houses here. But soon he found out. And so here we are today, 80 years later, and I've been at this 20 years, and thanks to Vievee, we're going to make it happen. We're here tonight to try and make Robert Frost and the history of this house come alive anew for you. And we hope it will be the first of many events like this as we transform the Robert Frost house into a living legacy, a center for the next generation of great American writers who are going to have the same creativity and the same inventiveness that Robert Frost had. Not many people realize what a revolutionary poet he was at that time. Not many people wrote in the vernacular of the small rural town. And when he first wrote this, he was in England, after striving for more than 3 decades to become recognized. And they fell in love with his poetry there. It was almost as if he were in exile and he came back to be a star. So I also want to talk about 2 other people here. First, George Francis. I'd like to say a little more. George and I have been on the board together for these same 2 decades, and I think for most of that time we sat next to each other. And there is nobody you'd rather sit next to. And all this time, every once in a while, he'd tell me about a daughter, Vievee Francis. And of course, I'm not a poet, as you're soon going to see when I try and read Frost poems when Marty does Belle's poems. But we did meet, like Christian said, at this house. In fact, it's a little more than 3 years ago. And I'm happy to say this will be the 3rd time we've planned an event together. And there is no more powerful poet than Vievee. But like Frost, for more than 2 decades, she struggled in obscurity. She had a wonderful, wonderful setting in Detroit where she created what is now known across the country as the Detroit School. And there, poets of color, new poets came, and she was like the mother hen for more than 2 decades. And in fact, one of her acolytes won the Pulitzer Prize this past spring. And a year ago this fall, Vievee was invited to come to Dartmouth as a professor. And boy, did she earn her stripes. She won 2 of the most important poetry awards in the United States and the world. She's now a full professor. She's recognized not only in the United States, but around the world. And I have no doubt that she's on the short list for the next Pulitzer. I guess I want to say one other thing, and that is we have a wonderful guest with us. Marty and I had the great privilege earlier in our tour, such as we might have had, to visit Ted Retke's house in Saginaw, and Annie Ransford is here, and I'd like you all to give her a very warm welcome. She has done immense great good at that place, and it is, how many events do you have there a year now? 12. And I mean, every event, and I've now been to 3 or 4 of them, is so fun and exciting, and Annie just is so welcoming a host. Thank you, Annie, and we're glad you're here. We got a lot to learn from you. So with that, let me begin. We're going to focus on the stories and poems Frost and the title character of our historical novel, The Belle of Two Arbors, shared at Michigan, including primarily the stories and poems in the spring of 1926. Because not to correct our president, but he only lived here 1 year, 1925 to 26. And maybe that's Vievee. We had to change the order a little tonight, so I hope you're not too disappointed you end up with Marty and me. But that means you get the home run hitter for after dinner, so it's going to work out. So by way of background, Marty and I both grew up in Ann Arbor, and we both summered up north. I summered since 1950 in the lee of the Sleeping Bear Sand Dunes in Glen Arbor, and Marty in Charlevoix. We were junior high school and high school classmates. We've been good friends for virtually our entire lives. And so when we came together about 10 years ago, I asked her to help, and because it's a little hard to be a guy and write in a woman's voice. And every once in a while, she'd slap me upside the head. She'd write a lot of great poems. In fact, I'd say, why don't we do this? This is kind of where the scene is, and this is how it's all going to work. And sure enough, Marty come back with a poem that was nothing like that. And I then rewrite the prose and the arc of the novel around her second sight, which is what poets have. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful time together. But as our 8 decades flash by in front of us, you'll have to forgive us because unlike Frost at 88, as you're going to see later tonight, we can't remember our lines. So I hope you'll forgive us if she reads her poems and I try and stick to a script. As you see, I wander occasionally. But no worries, though. We have the video that, in fact, Vievee has seen it twice, and we're going to run a different version of it here tonight of the last 3 years of Robert Frost, 88 years, and how his life intertwined with President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And I'm going to ask you, as you listen to what we're going to talk about this evening, to hold in your suspense whether or not you think Robert Frost actually lived up to the promise you're going to hear about when he first came to Michigan. In the fall of 1962, I went to Amherst College. I majored in history. I got lost exploring in the archives of the old library there. And this is also the small town where America's greatest 19th century poet lived. We just didn't know how great she was until the 20th century. And it's also the place where Frost always came back. He called it home because it always had to take him in to compose and campaign for his poetry in the 20th century. At Michigan Law School, I began my study of the history and meaning of the 14th Amendment, which provides, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The meaning of this application of this constitutional prohibition against official prejudice has engaged me for the 60 years I've been in private and public life. After pursuing too many careers, and I won't bore you with them, all involving history and research into original sources, and I might add all with mixed results, I turned to fiction to write better endings. So the basic plot of this novel. Belle is a poet born in Glen Arbor in December 1899, but so private she refuses to allow a single poem to be published during her life. Weaned by her invalid mother on Dickinson's wild verse, Belle loses her dear mama at age 13 to drowning when a rare natural disaster, a seiche, breaks the thick ice in January, and the teenage daughter has to swim her little brother Pip from their sinking ice fishing shanty safely to shore. At age 21, Belle fledges home, her teenage brother still in tow, to attend the big university in Ann Arbor, to write great poems, and there she meets Robert Frost, and soon thereafter Michigan's Ted Ratke and England's Wystan Auden. So tonight, let's begin our story at the point in time when Belle first arrives in Ann Arbor. Michigan's 47-year-old president, Marion Leroy Burton, found a kindred spirit when he brought Robert Frost at the same age to Michigan as a, quote, creative fellow in the fall of 1921 to launch a revolutionary experiment. As Burton wrote to the donor, former Regent and Governor Chase Osborne, quote, "A real university should be a patron of art, literature, and creative activity. We ought to have on campus creative artists who are actually producing the results which influence the thought of nations," end quote. In his acceptance letter, Frost embraced the president's vision, quote, "for keeping the creative and the erudite together in higher education where they belong, and where we would also like the creative to make its demand on the young student," end quote. In that first year, Frost was a huge hit. His many meetings with the student writers and his cover poems inspired by the contributions led to 4 issues of the Whimsies literary magazine. He packed Hill Auditorium 6 times, and he became the talk of the town. At the Soda Emporium on North U, a sign in the window advertised a chocolate-coated ice cream confection. Quote, "Frost Bite, 10 cents. Not to be outdone, around the corner on State Street, War's Bookstore included in its front window all of Frost's books of poetry under the sign, quote, "Frost Bark, very little worse than his bite." One evening at dinner at the president's house on South U, Frost stole the show with his gentle criticism of, quote, "ivory towers, including this Harvard of the West." Went down a little easier that way. And after dinner, he, of course, said several of his poems, and he knew of the hundreds of poems that he wrote over his life. He knew every one of them by heart. He could get up and tell a story and say his poems. It didn't matter the setting, whether it was an inaugural address for the United States of America, or 5 kids in a classroom, or 3,500 at Hill Auditorium. After dinner, President Burton said, "Our fellow in creative arts once again shows why he's as popular on this campus as Fielding Yost." "Well, let's put that to the test," Frost retorted. "You schedule a reading for me at Hill Auditorium on any Saturday afternoon there's a home game. Ferry Field will be sold out, and no one will be at Hill, not even me, because I'll be at the stadium cheering for Coach Yost's boys too." Frost thereby only proved the president's point. These 2 giants, at 47 years old, had established a bond that only death would sever. So Burton cobbled together donations to fund a second year for his creative fellow to continue the experiment. No teaching responsibilities. Write your poems and do as you can, campaign across the country. Meet with students, inspire them, and great things are going to happen. And Belle grew from Frost's starstruck student acolyte to a star student poet, trusted mentee, welcoming host at her family cottage up north, and typist for his drafts of new poems for his next book titled New Hampshire, his first Pulitzer Prize book. Yet there were rumblings of discontent from 2 divided English departments at Michigan. You're not going to believe it. There was one department for the academic literature crowd that was on the main diag. And then there was a separate English department on the wrong side of State Street in a dilapidated old building called West Hall. Many in the 2 separate faculties appeared to share in common only their objection to Burton paying his creative fellow, who taught no classes, more than they made teaching 3 or more courses each semester. And Frost didn't cotton to the academic snobs who only revered long-dead poets while criticizing him for trying to make history by creating timeless new poems. On one of their many long walks from their nearby homes on Washtenaw and Cambridge, to and from campus, Frost grumped to Belle, "Hope our President Burton finishes Angel Hall before this creative fellow gets burned up in that beat-up old fire trap West Hall where I've been relegated." One of the academic snobs, Ned Straight, the new Shakespeare scholar from Harvard, did his best to spread rumors under the pseudonym Nym, N-Y-M, a conniving tattletale in several of Shakespeare's plays. He claimed Frost was too busy playing with favorites like Belle to fulfill the university's obligation to teach all students. In Belle's freshman English class, however, Professor Straight ridiculed students who dared challenge his rhetorical questions, leered at every girl as he strutted up and down the aisles, and mocked all the students' writings. With not a single woman on either English faculty, and none anywhere else in LS&A, Belle knew she was up against the same prejudice at Michigan that her gruff father still displayed up north. You see, he asked her to raise her little brother so the boy could take over running the family stoveworks when he grew into a man. You see, Belle wanted to chair their family empire as much as she was driven to compose great poems. This was a woman who was a force of nature, despite the many internal demons she struggled with all her life. And although Burton couldn't raise the funds to keep the poet a third year, Michigan's president continued to court Frost for a permanent position after his return to Amherst. And Burton was vindicated when Frost's new book, New Hampshire, was dedicated to Michigan and won the 1924 Pulitzer Prize. With that, Burton finally decided to rearrange Michigan's entire lit school budget to prevail over Amherst in the ongoing battle for Frost, with the offer of a lifetime appointment as a, quote, permanent fellow in letters. And it was at a full professor's salary, but with responsibility to host only one small poetry writing seminar every other semester. The great experiment the two had launched only 4 years before appeared set to become an integral part of the University of Michigan. Alas, before Frost could set foot back in Ann Arbor, Burton died, and Belle fled from Straight's obscene attempt to abuse her to her cottage up north, followed by a transfer from creative writing to Michigan's new business school. Frost gave the eulogy for his good friend Burton at a full house in Hill Auditorium in May of 1925. Ned Straight and the other pedants of his ilk still looked down on Frost, all the more because of his high pay and minimal teaching load when he would return in the fall. They said the poet's talk on students learning by doing and the important role of the creative arts in higher education was more Frost's view than Burton. Belle instead thought, quote, that was the highest compliment Robert Frost could pay any person, dead or alive, as the two men were remarkably kindred spirits on this subject. So after being absent for the fall semester, Frost wrote Belle in January of 1926, quote, I'm feeling mighty guilty about my duty to serve our late president to teach one poetry seminar to earn my year's keep. I hope you'll sign up and get the 3 graces. Those were his 3 favorite women students, other than Belle, to join us. Belle couldn't resist helping her old friend. After Frost returned alone to the welcoming clapboard house on Pontiac Trail, this house, Belle arrived every day after her morning of B-school classes. She woke Frost, prepared a hearty lunch, and typed his draft all afternoon so he could compose poems into the wee hours of the morning. This was the most productive 3 months of poetry writing he had in his entire career. The very first afternoon after Belle finished typing this very first draft, Frost said, quote, this poem will be my contribution to President Burton's memory, long before the new little president, George Little. Before he raises the money to build a bell tower to honor Big Burton, my luminary clock will be published. Now listen to Acquainted with the Night, as Belle did then at the Robert Frost House. I have been one acquainted with the night I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither right nor wrong. I have been one acquainted with the night. When Frost finished saying the poem, he asked Belle, "You going to contribute to the bricks and mortar memorial for Burton?" Belle replied, "Don't see the relevance, since you know your one luminary clock against the sky at an earthly height isn't any bell tower but the moon." When Frost nodded sheepishly, she added, "I already persuaded other donors to match my gifts so Mrs. Burton and the children can live with his memory without having to beg instead." And it would be another long 10 years till the Burton Tower was finished. Yet Belle loved Frost's new short poem much more than the too long one about a clock tower, "I Will Sing You 1-0," she had typed for him in 1921. She asked, "Why so much personal about battling the black dog of depression here?" Frost answered, "The new book's about the contraries, the small fights we each can make to spark a little life in the inevitable dark." Later that afternoon, Belle had to address an even more personal subject, the longest by far of the several poems she'd typed, "The Lonely Shall Be Choosers." This was a part of an ongoing challenge that started in 1921 between Belle and Frost to write an adequate goodbye remembrance or elegy for the respective mothers. When she pulled it out of the pile, Frost nodded and said, "At long last, my ode to my mama, who shares your nickname, Belle. What do you think?" Well, what with its length, invisible voices from the ancient past, and making his mother into a Job-like caricature, she thought it inadequate. But she replied only by reciting what he had said to her before about her earlier try at an elegy for her mama. Quote, "You need to hold it a while," she began, but with a puckish smile, Frost interjected, quote, "and deepen it, deepen it." And what's interesting about this poem, this was for a book called West Running Brook that came out in 1927, the year after he left Ann Arbor. And he didn't include it in the book. He added, "Still working on your goodbye to Mama?" And Belle nodded. A few weeks later, outside the room in Angel Hall where Frost led his once-a-week poetry seminar for 12 students, Belle ran into Ned Straight at the door to the room. When he looked down his nose at Belle and told her he was, quote, "fixing to monitor," end quote, the class, Belle pushed him away hard and said, "Over my dead body." Frost must have heard the commotion, for he opened the door to see what was going on. And Belle said, "You know Professor Straight, but he also goes by the nickname Nim." Vievee! I thought I had this. Now I do. I apologize. That sent Straight into retreat down the hall. After Belle explained what Straight was up to, Frost returned to the class, rambled a bit about the divisions on the English faculties, and he ended the seminar for the year, 3 weeks in. Quote, "Just write one decent poem you treasure enough you want me to give it back to you, rather than to tear it up. When it's ready, each of you will meet at my house so we can discuss it together, one-on-one, okay?" And at the end of the semester, Frost and his wife, Eleanor, hosted a party at their home on Pontiac Trail for the seminar participants and the creative writers from the now two student literary magazines. After calling up several others to accept his praise, Frost concluded bestowing his honors by saying, "Miss Belle, would you care to recite the best poem from Michigan?" Well, Belle was so nervous, she confessed to Frost she couldn't remember the words to the poem she'd written for the seminar. No, Frost said, this is an older poem. It's your perfect sonnet. Now hear Marty say one of her up north songs, as Belle did that night.
Delight of life. We walk along the sandy shore among piles of pale driftwood, carved smooth, bleached white by decades of nature's slow and steady strum. Fuel perfect for a campfire any night, with you sitting close beside me to share a rite of passage as old as Eden's vine, joined by the slap of waves against the pier, a soft tulu echoing through the pine, the whine of wind against a sailboat's mast, amidst the burning crackle and shifting fire. The silver crescent moon rising in the east, the flicker of fireflies sparking love's desire, fading like tiny stars to memory, dear, as soon the imprint of our bodies here.
You know, Frost was what he called an ear reader. He thought poems were meant to be heard aloud and not just read on a piece of paper. And I have to tell you, Marty is a poet for sound. Frost picked up his ginger ale and raised it high and said, "A toast to the Belle of Two Arbors, Glenn and Anne." But after the party, Frost told Belle he was leaving Michigan for an even better offer, at Amherst College again, closer to his now grown but not yet independent 4 children who lived within an hour's drive of the small men's college. Yet there was much irony in Frost's decision. He and Eleanor had come to love this home, quote, the very charming house, he called it, away from the bustle of campus on Pontiac Trail. And that spring, his 2 youngest daughters found an even more welcoming home here, inside the walnut timbers of its, quote, hen and chicken architecture, a large middle with 2 wings. Irma, depressed and anxious, found a Michigan man to marry. Marjorie, Frost's favorite, the youngest and quite sickly for many years, found a healing respite. Even Eleanor loved this house. And on the poet's return to Amherst, the, quote, sickness and scatteration, end quote, that haunted his family struck with unremitting vengeance over the next 13 years. With the loss of his wife to a vicious cancer, daughter Marjorie to puerperal fever after childbirth, and Irma to insanity and institutionalization, and his only son to suicide by a shotgun. Yes, Frost was acquainted with the night. In the last week before heading up north for the summer, Belle stopped by Frost's house to say goodbye and type several more poems. She read the last as his kiss-off, describing her and his many other student acolytes as irritating, quote, minor birds. Belle stomped out to her car. Frost followed with a pamphlet in hand and waved, and he explained that he wrote the poem for the cover of the spring issue of the student literary magazine. It wasn't supposed to be meant to be about her in particular. He handed her the final issue of the Outlanders and added, "The 3 Graces and their boyfriends take pot shots at Nim." This is a true story. Belle read the lines that Frost had underlined in several of the stories about the snooty sexist academic dubbed Nim Sanders in 6 of the short stories. The rest of Frost's student acolytes had indeed outed Ned straight. Belle couldn't help chuckling and extended her hand to the poet who would remain her close friend, colleague, and correspondent for the rest of her life. So before we get back to Burton and Frost and their meaning, let's do two more poems that they shared this spring of 1926. First, Frost's Spring Pools. These pools that though in forest still reflect the total sky almost without defect, and like the flowers beside them chill and shiver, will like the flowers beside them soon be gone, and yet not out by any brook or river, but up by roots to bring dark foliage on. The trees that have it in their pent-up buds to darken nature and be summer woods, let them think twice before they use the powers to blot out and drink up and sweep away these flowery waters and these watery flowers from snow that melted only yesterday. Now hear Marty's different view of this time when winter changes into spring. Her rhapsody, Up North.
Up north. My yearning for Leelanau is like a disease. The sun through my window bids me awake. A chorus of robins sings through the trees to return to her bosom, where she offers ease from the thorns and the thistly losses that ache. My yearning for Leelanau is like a disease. The shoreline's now free from its ice-sculpted frieze, and frothy white waves roll, tumble, and shake. 5 or 6 finches peek out through the leaves. I dream of the pond near our bubbling creek, the nest of a wood duck and her handsome drake. My yearning for Leelanau is like a disease. A riot of flowers, the hum of the bees, the honeyed fragrance of spring in their wake. A red-headed woodpecker taps on the tree. Soon brown-eyed Susans will sway in the breeze, the squawk of seagulls, the bluest of seas. My yearning for Leelanau is like a disease. A chorus of robins sings through the trees.
You see why at most of these occasions I'm just the setup man. So let us close with the two poems that became, one is Frost's most famous elegy, which he shared with Belle, and the other is Belle's elegy about her mother. And seeing as Belle finished first in 1931 with her poem, she sent it to Frost in a letter. I'm going to let Marty go first, and then I'll close.
Goodbye to Mama. Water below ice spilling from our fishing hole, sly silence, and then one long, lonely crack. Our fishing shanty's heaving sigh, spinning silver shards, brother 'neath my arm, her gloved hand waving toward shore, Mama's gray goodbye, frozen arm flailing, reaching for life, pumping hard through heartless gray shock, now stroking steady in peaceful rhythmic splendor, lake lips caressing the hills and valleys of my cold, suffering soul. Oh, blue salvation.
Well, at Michigan's first Hopwood Awards in 1931, Frost, of course, honored that poem. In the fall of 1937, Frost shared his poem, The Silken Tent, in a letter to Belle. Let your old friend know if at long last I meet your challenge to sing an adequate goodbye to my mama. Frost's mother was named Isabel and shared the same nickname, Belle. Yet Belle also thought of Frost's wife, still bedridden and unlikely to recover from what Frost described as, quote, the doctor's ripping of vicious cancer from Eleanor's womanhood, end quote. Belle wrote back, your silken tent sings beyond my challenge. Eons from now, the elegist will say it as a memorial for a mother or for a similarly selfless wife or woman friend. In fact, I know this. I read this poem when I was asked by the family to say a poem for my mother-in-law, and she left me the lead poem of A Witness Tree, and there it was, open to that page. But Belle thought something else, a second idea. Indeed, your perfect sonnet may also be heard as a proposal to engage a lover that no woman could ever resist. And I know I won't do it justice, but please now listen to Frost's love song, the lead poem in his fourth and final Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Witness Tree. The Silken Tent, all in one sentence, winding through all the lines of its sonnet. Hear it now. She is as in a field a silken tent at midday when the sunny summer breeze has dried the dew and all its ropes relent. So to then guise it gently sways at ease in its supporting central cedar pole that is its pinnacle to heavenward and signifies the sureness of the soul, seems to owe naught to any single cord, but strictly held by none, is loosely bound by countless silken ties of love and thought, to everything on earth the compass round, and only by one's going slightly taut in the capriciousness of the summer air is of the slightest bondage made aware. Marty and I like to think that no poet could pay a higher tribute to a close woman friend, colleague, and poet than Frost did when he read The Silken Tent many, many years later at Belle's memorial service at the First Presbyterian Church in Ann Arbor. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you, Paul and Marty. Another round of applause, please. Yes, that really was great. Now, I see Paul at our board meetings for many years now. This is a new side. I like it. We are going to now make our way to Eagle Tavern for a wonderful farm-to-table meal, and we will hear from Vievee after dinner during our dessert. Thank you so much for your attention, and we'll see you in Eagle Tavern. I believe we have cars lined up, or it's a simple walk too, so up to you.
Okay, you got to listen up again, class. You know, you can eat the salad, but I want you to pay attention. Forgive me for that. I want you to bear witness with me tonight to an extraordinary documentary film. It's only 7.5 minutes long. We put it together from the archives of Amherst College, from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, the Bentley Historical Library at Michigan. And it covers the final 3 years of Frost's life and death. And you will recall in my talk that I said he came to Michigan on a grand experiment with President Burton about trying to make the creative and the erudite come together to transform higher education. and to allow the creative insights of some of our great artists to influence the policy and thought of the nation. And Burton died and Frost left. But after this film is over, I ask you to think about the question whether or not Frost fulfilled his promises to President Burton. The video includes 4 events. The first ever poem by a poet at a presidential inauguration on January 20th, 1961. It then goes to the spring of 1962 when Frost came back to Michigan on 2 different occasions for a final encore to the many who loved him here and a final thank you from the many at Michigan who love Frost. And it closes with the final fated public address of John Fitzgerald Kennedy at Amherst College in the fall of 1963, shortly before he was assassinated. So if I could just have your attention for 7.5 minutes, you'll see something that nobody else in the country can watch at this moment, but we hope will come a part of the Robert Frost House experience ever after.
The land was ours before we were the land. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts and Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by what we now no more possess. Something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war, to the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become, has become, and for this occasion let me change that to what she will become. And this poem, what I was leading up to, was a dedication of the poem to the President-elect, Mr. John Dimond. You want to hear a romantic one, a little one, a sonnet. And you know, it took John Crowe Ransom to find out that I wrote sonnets. You know, I've sneaked them in because they're such a reproach. But I've written them all my life. The first one in my first book was a sonnet. But this happens to be about a lady. It happens to be an old-fashioned praise poem, just same as they used to write to a lady's eyebrow or something, you know. This is about a lady's voice. The name of the poem is Never Again Would Bird's Song Be the Same, see. He would declare and could himself believe that the birds there in all the garden round, from having heard the day-long voice of Eve, had added to their own an oversound, her tone of meaning, though without the words. Admittedly an eloquence so soft could only have had an influence on birds when call of laughter carried it aloft. Be that as may be, she was in their song. Moreover, her voice upon their voices crossed had now persisted in the woods so long that probably it never would be lost. Never again would bird's song be the same, and to do that to birds was why she came. Let's leave it that way, shall we?
Mr. President, I present Robert Frost to receive the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws. The university acknowledges the public offices of this sometime poet in residence and frequent and most welcome guest in the degree now conferred on him, Doctor of Laws.
This day, devoted to the memory of Robert Frost, offers an opportunity for reflection which is prized by politicians as well as by others, and even by poets. For Robert Frost was one of the granite figures of our time in America. He was supremely two things, an artist and an American. A nation reveals itself not only by the men it produces, but also by the men it honors, the men it remembers. In America, our heroes have customarily run to men of large accomplishments. But today, this college and country honors a man whose contribution was not to our size, but to our spirit, not to our political beliefs, but to our insight, not to our self-esteem, but to our self-comprehension. In honoring Robert Frost, we therefore can pay honor to the deepest sources of our national strength. That strength takes many forms. The most obvious forms are not always the most significant. The men who create power make an indispensable contribution to the nation's greatness. But the men who question power make a contribution just as indispensable, especially when that questioning is disinterested. For they determine whether we use power or power uses us. Our national strength matters, but the spirit which informs and controls our strength matters just as much. This was the special significance of Robert Frost. He brought an unsparing instinct for reality to bear on the platitudes and pieties of society. His sense of the human tragedy fortified him against self-deception and easy consolation. I have been, he wrote, one acquainted with the night. And because he knew the midnight as well as the high noon, because he understood the ordeal as well as the triumph of the human spirit, he gave his age strength with which to overcome despair. At bottom, he held a deep faith in the spirit of man. And it's hardly an accident that Robert Frost coupled poetry and power, for he saw poetry as the means of saving power from itself. When power leads man towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the areas of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses. For art establishes the basic human truth, which must serve as the touchstone of our judgment. The artist, however faithful to his personal vision of reality, becomes the last champion of the individual mind and sensibility against an intrusive society and an officious state. The great artist is thus a solitary figure. He has, as Frost said, a lover's quarrel with the world. In pursuing his perceptions of reality, he must often sail against the currents of his time. This is not a popular role. If Robert Frost was much honored during his lifetime, it was because a good many preferred to ignore his darker truths. Yet, in retrospect, we see how the artist's fidelity has strengthened the fiber of our national life. If sometimes our great artists have been the most critical of our society, it is because their sensitivity and their concern for justice, which must motivate any true artist, makes him aware that our nation falls short of its highest potential. I see little of more importance to the future of our country and our civilization than full recognition of the place of the artist. Robert Frost was often skeptical about projects for human improvement. Yet I do not think he would disdain this hope. As he wrote during the uncertain days of the Second War, take human nature altogether, since time began, and it must be a little more in favor of man, say a fraction of 1% at the very least, our hold on the planet wouldn't have so increased. Because of Mr. Frost's life and work, because of the life and work of this college, our hold on this planet has increased.
You have to forgive me for being a bit emotional. This was the occasion on October 26th, 1963, for the groundbreaking of the Robert Frost Memorial Library at Amherst College. I was there. I met the president. I shook his hand, and then he was gone forever. But going on 54 years later, I can safely say this: no president will ever again so honor a poet for his contributions to American life, higher education, and democracy. And when all is said and done, I submit that Robert Frost fulfilled this promise that he shared with Michigan's President Marion Leroy Burton. Thank you.
Great, I'm glad you liked it. First of all, we wanted to mention that both Paul and Marty's book, the first book, Belle of Two Arbors, is available up front, as well as Vievee's book, Forest Primeval, are available up front too. They're signed copies for you. So great works of literature, great works of art. I'd like to introduce Vievee for you. Vievee Francis' work appeared in many numerous journals, poetry journals, textbooks, and anthologies. She's taught poetry for many years. As Paul talked about Vievee's journey, I just want to give some kind of keynotes and punctuations along that journey. 2009, she received the Ron and Jaffe's Writer Award. In 2010, a Kresge Fellowship. She was honored, though, with the Hurston Wright Legacy Award in 2016 for her Forest Primeval book, which is an amazing accomplishment. But this year, folks, this year she was honored the paradigm-changing award that changes the lives of all poets. This year, she was honored with the Kingsley K. Tufts Fellowship Poetry Award from Claremont University. And what this means is, if anybody heard like a MacArthur Fellowship, okay, it's that for poetry. $100,000 given to a poet to, in their career, to open the portal of their career. These are given to poets that are great, but they're just about to break through and to break through into the public. So think about that. She earned the top award in our nation of poetry, and truly paradigm changing because it creates new audiences, new connections, and new relationships and relevancy to the public for poetry. So with that, everybody, let's listen to our poet, Vievee Francis.
Thank you. It's really wonderful being here. And being here has been a long journey. I'm so grateful to the Henry Ford for putting on this event and for doing what Kennedy asked that we do in that video, that we give poetry a platform, that we understand its power and use it to grow ourselves and to grow our nation. And I want to thank the board, everyone involved with the Henry Ford, but I want to give some special thanks to a gentleman who was my acquaintance through my father, and now he's my great friend, Paul Dimond. He came into my life and just believed in my work and rallied for me and listens to all of my plans and proposals. And I want to thank Mr. Overland, too, for thinking that it was possible to see possibilities for a living museum regarding the Henry Ford site, or the Robert Frost site. To not just have it as a place where you go in and you're viewing, but you're interacting. And Robert Frost was an innovator. His legacy lives through the poets that discuss him, that read him, whose work is influenced by him. Full disclosure, my husband and I were married here. My husband's also a poet, poet Matthew Scott Holzman. And we got married at the little chapel, and we had our reception here. But in between that, the drivers of one of the carriages took us by the Frost house, and they weren't supposed to let us in, and they did. So if don't let me get them in trouble, or I'll have to pay the salaries they'll lose. But and we sat there in our wedding clothes on the floor. You couldn't move through the house because of the glass. So we sat there on the floor, and we just said to ourselves, Robert Frost, that's what we want. We want to be poets that make an impact, that have a ripple inside of the landscape. So I feel really emotional too, and deeply connected to this place that I love. Okay. I'm going to begin by reading back and forth 3 poems by Frost, and then 3 poems by myself, and then I'll end with a few more from Forest Primeval. And I'm in conversation with older poets. I'm in conversation with poets who set up the American landscape in a pastoral way. My husband got a job in the mountains of North Carolina at the juncture of the Blue Ridge and the Smokies in Asheville. And I didn't want to go. And he calls me Bunny. He said, Bunny, I can't do it without you. So I went. I left Detroit and went to these mountains. It was the most frightening thing I'd ever experienced. And because I'd been living in Detroit and Hamtramck back and forth, I thought I was pretty tough, pretty urban, right? And I thought I could handle it. I was scared of everything. Scared of the tree frogs, scared of the bears, scared of the insects. What were those insects? Things coming over the mountains. Oh, it's terrifying. So I began to write a series of anti-pastorals. I had to try to negotiate my dream, which was a loft in Chelsea with a tree and a potted, and a kind of potter here. But anyway, now I love the mountains, and I live in the upper chain of those same mountains now in New Hampshire. Okay. This is Robert Frost, The Pasture. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away and wait to watch the water clear, I may. I shan't be gone long. You come too. I'm going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by its mother. It's so young, it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be gone long. You come too. And now I'll read my own poem, another anti-pastoral. I want to put down what the mountain has awakened, my mouthful of grass, my curious tale. I want to stand still but find myself moved patch by patch. There's a bleed in my throat. Words fail me here. Can you understand? I sink to my knees, tired or not. I now know the ragweed from the goldenrod and the blinding beauty of green. Don't you see? I'm shedding my skins. I am a paper hive, a wolf spider, the creeping ivy, the ache of a birch, a heifer, a doe. I have fallen from my dream of progress, the clear-cut glass, the potted and balconied tree, the lemon-waxed wood over marbled pillar into my own nocturne, the lullabies I had forgotten. How could I know what slept inside? what would rend my fantasies to cud. And up from this belly's wet straw-strewn field, these soundings. In that piece, I reference the lullabies that slept within. And what I'm speaking of is my childhood. For a very brief time, I lived in the piney woods of East Texas, where my mother's from. And every summer I go back to those piney woods in that dark forest. For the first time, I took my husband into those piney woods about a month ago. My mother passed away. And I'm dedicating this reading tonight to her. And he saw those woods and he said, "Oh, it's really dark here." I said, "Yes, it is," right? And so living in the mountains and that forest kind of reopened that childhood sense of awe and fear and sublimity of living in the forest. This is from Robert Frost. It's called "To the Thawing Wind." Come with rain, O loud southwester. Bring the singer, bring the nester. Give the buried flower a dream. Make the settled snowbank steam. Find the brown beneath the white, but whate'er you do tonight, bathe my window, make it flow, melt it as the ice will go. Melt the glass and leave the sticks like a hermit's crucifix. Burst into my narrow stall, swing the picture on the wall. Run the rattling pages o'er, scatter poems on the floor. Turn the poet out the door. And for myself, White Mountain. It's the name of the mountain that I lived on in North Carolina. There's a wind here so strong it shakes this stone house. A howl from pain and cold, a particular anguish, not a foot in a trap, but a foot in the trap and the snow getting deeper. I look out under the leafless beach, which I'd take for dead if I didn't believe in spring's coming. I walk around the property thinking I might happen upon the source of that sound. How could that cry be wind alone? Something has snapped in two. Something has been lost that won't return in this life. I want to find the source. I'm stumbling in a thin coat that flaps at my sides. It seems as if I might ride the beast that haunts me if I could just let go. Let it take me up as easily as this gale is lifting me now. And one of my favorite poems from Robert Frost, The Vantage Point. If tired of trees, I seek again mankind. Well, I know where to hie me in the dawn, to a slope where the cattle keep the lawn. There amid lolling juniper reclined, myself unseen, I see in white defined far off the homes of men, and farther still the graves of men on an opposing hill, living or dead, whichever are to mind. And if by noon I have too much of these, I have but to turn on my arm, and lo, the sunburned hillside sets my face aglow. My breathing shakes the bluet like a breeze. I smell the earth, I smell the bruised plant. I look into the crater of the ant. I'm quite, yes, we should always clap when Robert Frost is read. Now I'm going to read first the poem Happy and a few more of my own, and I'm deeply influenced by Robert Frost, though it may not show in the ways you anticipate. This poem begins with an epigraph by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Listen to a tale of love in Acadia, home of the happy. Happy? I wouldn't say so. Rather settled in this moment where no axe falls. And one might wonder why not happy in such an idyllic place, with more trees than might be named, and the blooms ever blooming in a heat seemingly ceaseless as the red-throated woodpeckers, as the tree frogs mating endlessly on the same limbs a black bear might loll from, indolent and berryful. You have heard me say nature will have its way. that we build only way stations. I was proud. I thought I understood, but now I have come to this Blue Ridge, which rests its toll. My sleep grows longer, my dreams follow into my days. I have begun to name the birds by their feathering, their calls and clamor: nightjar, flicker, plover, shrike. Before the mountain, I knew the incinerated cities. I knew another South, but that was before I was another, the one I am becoming as roots reclaim this soil, as what was felled takes on a form it could not have imagined, whose seeds had always rested below, like a sorrow of banjos. Skinned. There are, after all, several ways to skin anything. My grandmother knew most of those ways. She had been skinned herself, so to speak, and that her skin was so often examined and found wanting. What would one want to do with it, really, despite the constant oiling which left her arms soft as anyone could possibly desire? Her hands were ruins. She never hit me with them. My grandfather took her with her hands at her sides. Laundry water, cotton bowls, horsehide, the blood of goats. She had to cook and I had to eat. She could skin a raccoon in minutes, revealing the purple flesh easy as snapping a guinea neck. She would have given anything to wake up in a new skin, though hers was delightful in the light. But what did I know? The toil took its toll, and though her face barely wrinkled, her knees and elbows darkened into the skin I wear now, roughened into the heels I scratch against a husband's calves because I don't listen. I refuse to wear shoes. I'm as country as she didn't want me to be. I loved the way she smelled, like outdoors, like new sheets, like hot grease and rifle burn, cream of wheat with coffee, front porch, corn cob. Her skin held all she did her best to scrub free, scrub so hard it liked to take the skin right off of her, which was what she wanted, to have it off on her own terms, not the eyes that demonized her, unsightly, dirty, unseemly. She saved for lace, for crinolines, for pretty gloves and wide-brimmed hats to hide her skin. My skin is mottled, stress-blemished, but soft as hers, and I know it. To find the pink below, I was convinced I had. I tried to burn it off. I'm not the first. I wore scarves she made to cover the evidence of my curiosity. Now I give myself over to the lotions of the day, disparage the oils she did not love but felt she needed. She'd stroke my cheek and say, "Good baby," and I'd feel good in my skin in that moment. I'd hold her tight and whisper, "You are the prettiest," and she'd feel good in hers. I want to forget, but I have my mirrors, and there she is, shadowed in a sunstruck field. So while I'm standing here, it's also a pleasure to be here. Earlier today, I was reading at University of Michigan with one of my closest friends, Sebastian Matthews, an incredible poet in his own right, and he's also the son of the canonical poet William Matthews. So he's very familiar with poetry and its necessity and lineage and innovation. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you too, Sebastian. So this last poem I'm going to dedicate to my father, whose heart is so brilliantly bruised, and to my little sister, for whom our mother was her best friend. And it's called A Small Poem. You know, you have those days when they're so difficult, and one person can do one small thing that turns it around, right? From a morning without expectation, a surprise, a word unanticipated and meant, rare and jarring, syllables moving one to tears, when the winter sky is a simple blue and nothing is there to impede the dailiness of things. But the word grows from a note, a hello, a salutation, and plants itself like a spring dandelion seed that by afternoon is fully grown and blowing more seeds, lightly, sweetly, a coloratura of delight. And I feel as if I were both the plucked and the child plucking the stem and twirling. How a single word can set the world turning from one moment into the next in startlement. Thank you.
As a child, were you interested in poetry?
Oh, that's such a funny question, because when you ask a poet most of the time when they started writing poetry, they say, all my life. No, not all my life. But my father had some old textbooks, and I would read the poetry in his textbooks, and he liked poetry. And I didn't know till many years later that he wrote it himself, that he had pieces himself. Oh, that was something to find out. And when I was 15 in high school, I heard Robert Browning's Soliloquy of the Spanish Cloister, and it made me cry. And then when I was 19, I heard the West Texan poet I, and it made me cry again. And I kept thinking, what is it about this work that's moving me? And especially with Robert Browning, British, another culture, another demographic, completely different than myself. How was he able to write these words that I felt like were transforming me? And I wanted to do that. I wanted to write something that could cross those lines, the oceans, barriers, and time, the way Frost moves us over time. So at 19, I started writing. I finally got brave enough, but I had loved it for a long time.
Okay, so I want to first of all say to Paul, and I'm going to say your name, Martha, that what you did earlier, if that would have been enough for me. I just thought it was beautiful, and I really learned more about the university and about Robert Frost, in a more meaningful way. That they weren't just, literary figures, but it really came to life. So thank you for that. And then, Vievee, you were just, for me, I think what you brought was the spiritual, to this evening. And that's what made it complete. Okay, and so I wanted to know what continues to, what songs haven't you sung yet?
Oh, that's a good question. This last book, I found it important. Since I'm 53, so writing since I was 19. This last book, I just kind of let go. I decided I was going to explore topics that fell into the transgressive, that were, and Kennedy, again, I'm going to reference that video. I love it so much. When Kennedy's talking about Frost, he basically says he has to go to those dark places and explore. And with this book, I went into dark places around womanhood, around race, and I had to keep doing that. But what's ahead is, the next text is called The Shared World, and I really want to explore our connections across time and space. And I don't want to say the things that make us similar. That's not enough. We have to be okay with the things that make us different as well. So I want to talk about what we actually share, not some kind of Pollyannistic idea of sharing, but what we actually share and what that means. So I'm going to have to be braver than I've ever been in my life, right? We'll see what happens. But I just read in front of my in-laws earlier today, and I said from the podium, well, they accept this, they're okay. I think they'll be okay. And my family is very indulgent with me as I do these explorations.
This has been an amazing evening. Full disclosure, I'm part of the team here at the Henry Ford. The portion out at the Frost home was absolutely incredible, and Vievee, what I was thinking about, the second to last poem that you read was particularly moving for me. And I loved it because it talks about the multi-sensory, among many other things, but I remember the line about sensing the rifle burn and the smell of cream of wheat. And I thought about how immersive that is. And I mean, when we think of Greenfield Village and our experience here tonight, it's an immersive experience. Your time at Dartmouth is fairly new?
I've been there a year and a term.
And what are the new immersions you're experiencing there? And maybe, do you imagine that they might find their way into your poetry?
They already are. The funny thing is, I said after I left the mountains, well, that's it for the mountains. And they say you need 5 years. Once you're there for 5 years, you're gone. You're going to be kept by the mountains. And so I was in the mountains for about 3 years. And now I find myself on the upper part of that same mountain chain. I cannot get away from the mountains. The mountains look different, but they're mountains. And and Vermont, and to full disclosure, Vermont and New Hampshire, there are not a lot of brown people there, right? So you would think that, and I said this earlier at University of Michigan, you would think that it's brown people I miss. No. I don't miss brown people. I miss round people. Because everybody there they seem to be a tip-top perfect health. You know, everyone's jogging on Saturday morning. I want to sleep in on Saturday morning. Everyone's jogging and et cetera. So it really makes me think about diversity in new ways, though, about body diversity. So I'm actually, believe it or not, it has opened up ideas for me around body and class and in that intersection. Right? There's an expectation in New England of certain things, in Upper New England of certain things, and so I'm exploring that now, right? And we'll see what happens.
This question is for Paul and for Marty. You know, Paul, I've known you for a long time, and I've seen different sides of you as a trustee, wonderful, brilliant sides of you. And tonight I was very happily pleased to see this new side of you. And you spoke so fondly of your lifelong friendship with Marty, and I just wonder what's next. And will you do something again together?
You want me to go, or do you want to go? So I mentioned, I believe, in our talk that I've been at this fiction writing for about 10 years. And the first one was a little too autobiographical. And it's called Widower's Song, and it's a love story. And I knew then, because Marty had been teaching and writing, and I knew her so well in Ann Arbor, that she did poetry. And so I had asked her then if she would mind writing a few haikus, as I mentioned. So I've got 2 books that are sort of in the bin that I'm going to resurrect. One's a political thriller, Succession at the White House. And the first one that I ever wrote, Widower's Song, I actually took out about 4 weeks ago and decided it isn't all bad. I'd rewritten it 4 times with the help of Nick Delbanco, who was the head of the creative writing program for so many decades at the University of Michigan. Vievee knows well. So Marty doesn't know it yet, but she's going to be published again. And I'm going to call on her because I learned how, because of this interaction that we've had, which has been so fantastic, where, you know, I'd say, oh, what about this poem? And she'd write something different, and of course I'd change the novel. She doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to sit down with her and give her the draft that's been hoary with age now 5 years and say, okay, can we make anything of this?
Yeah, that's great.
Well, unlike Vievee, I have been writing all my life. From when I was a teenager, what the collaboration with Paul has done for me is caused me to go back and look at all the poems that I have written. They're on scraps of paper, they're in journals. I always journal when I travel. I write poems wherever I am. I'm in a poetry circle. We meet a couple times a month and we critique each other's work. And I thought that maybe, I mean, this is the first time with Paul that I've been published, but I thought, why not try a chapbook of my own? So,
Absolutely.
I have one for all three of you. So we were at the Robert Frost house tonight, and we've been reading Robert Frost poems. What should we do moving forward? We made history tonight here with all three of you presenting literature and talking about Robert Frost as the basis of that. What should we do, Vievee, as a teacher, a professor at Dartmouth? How should this place move forward with Robert Frost? How should we inspire students?
Well, earlier this morning, those things were on my, well, they're often on my mind, so it's not surprising when those things are on my mind. But this morning I was talking to someone about the Richard Hugo House out in the Pacific Northwest and the Rothke House that's up in Saginaw, right? And this site is a perfect place for a kind of continued vibrancy, right? The house should have a reader in it, right? And in collaboration with a kind of education system out too, so students have access to that. But the community here in metropolitan Detroit is rich with incredible poets. And one of the things about the Detroit poetry community that I think is stronger, honestly, I'm going to say, than in any other community, is that we don't think twice about poetry and education. Almost every single poet I know from this region doesn't have to guess at whether they're going to reach out to someone younger or not. They simply do it. They're deeply involved in the community in a way I've not seen, and I'm not saying other communities in New York aren't great. I'm simply saying that there's something deeper here. It's, again, there's no questioning. It simply happens. It's organic. The sense of responsibility for future poets. And actually, to be honest, there are some places that make fun of that. Why not be a poet, move in your own head, and reach out to no one? That's very possible. But I think we've got something here that's special, and this particular site can really be a hub for amazing poetry activity.
Paul commented on, in his talk out at the Robert Frost House, that Robert Frost and Burton innovated a new model in education by the artist in residence, the poet in residence. The idea of Robert actually being there teaching a class every other semester was a new model for the university.
Yes.
Is that a model for us, do you think? Having a poet in residence, an entrepreneur in residence, an innovator in residence?
well, I love the idea of a poet in residence here, but one of the things that I was thinking about is the fact that you have a charter school here, and there always could be a poetry workshop for those kids, and you might be able then to have a presentation just like this evening, showcasing their work.
I like this idea.
I like that. Yeah.
Well, not to get personal about the evening, but when Vievee says there's something organic about this Detroit school, it's not just organic, it's Vievee. She's been, as I mentioned, the mother hen, the mentor for at least a couple of generations now, and in fact, I often wonder what's going to happen with Vievee so far away in the mountains, and I have a suggestion on that score. As you know, the Henry Ford has the Benson Ford Archives, which is probably one of the greatest archives in the entire country about innovation, creativity, inventiveness, including, by the way, in literature and poetry. And I think it would be obviously a place where Vievee and the Detroit School should be remembered and come alive. This is the place where we're here for the first night launching this new venture to transform the Robert Frost House into a living legacy. And what better way to do it than to start with Vievee. You can see how glad I was that the program got reversed so I didn't have to follow her. And I don't mean to put the pressure on her, but
Oh, no pressure.
I'm just saying her life story, including the part I never heard until tonight about the father and his poetry, who I've sat with so many years here. I can't think of anything better to kick this off than what we've done tonight. It really was an amazing experience, and to have this come together, Vievee, I can't tell you how much I admire you, and it would be a high honor for us. Vievee also serves, by the way, as a trustee of the Robert Frost Place in Franconia, and she knows how to put on a good show. I think we could make this place into something that would be unique in America and fit in with all of the other great stories of innovation and invention, and as Patricia said in her opening remarks, carrying it forward, and that's our mission for the next generation.
Thank you.
This has truly been an amazing evening. I hope I can tell just by the silence and the applause and the gasps and the laughter here and there how special you all felt that it was. This was an experiment for us. We weren't sure if this is something that we could pull off. I think we did it, thanks to all of you. Thanks to Paul and Marty and to Vievee. I was very moved this evening, and I think there's a lot more of this to come. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for the inspiration, Vievee, Paul, and Marty. Truly, I have goosebumps. I tell my staff all the time, if I get goosebumps, it's a goosebump moment here. It for me, really, really makes a difference. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. George, Evan, thank you. These are extraordinary trustees for this institution, along with Paul. We can't do it without all of you. Can't do it without the staff. It was amazing, and the food was really good. Really good. So, thank you. Drive home safely, and look for this again. We're going to do something else. We appreciate it.